Imagine you are a 25-year-old woman living in ancient Egypt around 1500 BCE. You wake up in the morning. The Nile is rising. Your household is loud and busy. And you just got your period. Now, the version of history most people carry in their heads goes something like this. You grabbed some leaves, said a prayer, suffered in silence. Just like every woman before recorded history was apparently doomed to do. That version is wrong. It is condescendingly, embarrassingly, almost insultingly wrong. And it tells you far more about how little attention historians have paid to the details of women's daily lives than it tells you about the actual intelligence of the women themselves. Here is the first thing you need to understand. The thing that flips the entire conversation on its head. Ancient women did not manage their periods the way you manage yours. Not because they had fewer resources, but because they had far, far fewer periods. Let that sink in for a second.
A modern woman in a developed country will experience somewhere between 400 and 500 menstrual cycles across her lifetime. A woman in ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, or a pre-agricultural society. Anthropologists estimate she may have had around 100, maybe fewer. Why? She was pregnant earlier, more often, and for longer. She breastfed for 2 to 3 years per child. And breastfeeding suppresses ovulation. She experienced periods of food scarcity that paused her cycle entirely. She likely hit puberty later due to lower body fat. The sheer physical intensity of daily ancient life kept her body in a constant state of energy management that modern bodies rarely experience. Anthropologists Gillian Bentley and Peter Ellison studied this for decades. They called it ecological ovarian suppression, the monthly, clockwork, predictable cycle that modern women expect. That is not an ancient universal. That is a modern, well-nourished, post-industrial anomaly. So the question, how did ancient women handle their periods, already contains a hidden assumption. The real answer begins with, not nearly as often as you think. And when they did handle them, they did so with a sophistication nobody put in the standard history books. Here is what the evidence actually shows us. The Ebers Papyrus, written in Egypt around 1550 BCE. Named after the German Egyptologist Georg Ebers, who purchased it in Luxor in 1873, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in all of human history. 110 pages, over 700 medical prescriptions, and it directly addresses gynecological conditions, including menstruation. Egyptian women are described in historical literature as using softened papyrus fiber as internal absorbent material. The concept that Procter & Gamble would patent in the 1930s, an absorbent internal device, was being documented in Egypt 3,000 years earlier. And the Ebers Papyrus also records remedies for excessive bleeding, irregular cycles, and pain management, plant-based, carefully described, passed between women as functional medical knowledge. These were not women improvising in the dark. These were women maintaining a shared, transgenerational body of gynecological expertise. Without libraries open to them, without formal medical schools, without the internet, they built that knowledge network from scratch, generation by generation, through oral transmission and lived experience. Now move forward and north. Ancient Rome, 1st century CE Pliny the Elder, the naturalist who literally died trying to observe the eruption of Vesuvius up close, which tells you everything about his personality, devoted substantial passages of his Naturalis Historia to menstruation. Some of it is genuinely alarming by modern standards. He believed menstrual blood could rust iron, kill bees, and destroy crops. But buried inside the mythology is evidence of what Roman women were actually using: soft wool soaked in oil, strips of linen, herbal treatments for pain including pennyroyal and artemisia. Plants we now know have real anti-inflammatory and antispasmodic properties. And then there is Soranus of Ephesus, Soranus practiced medicine in Rome in the 2nd century CE. He wrote a text simply titled Gynecology, one of the earliest comprehensive medical textbooks on women's reproductive health ever produced. Unlike Pliny, he was skeptical of superstitious claims. He documented soft wool and linen as standard absorption materials. He described what we would now recognize as endometriosis, in clinical language, not mythology. A physician, taking women's pain seriously. In the 2nd century, this is not what the textbooks usually emphasize. Here is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Archaeological and historical evidence from Viking-era Scandinavia suggests that Norse women used sphagnum moss as their primary absorbent material. And this is not a random grab from the nearest riverbank. Sphagnum moss absorbs up to 20 times its own weight in liquid. It has natural antimicrobial properties that were later confirmed by researchers who used it in wound dressings during World War I. It outperforms, by certain metrics, the first generation of commercial sanitary products manufactured in the early 20th century. Norse women were not improvising. They were selecting a specific plant with specific understood properties. That is empirical botanical knowledge, tested, refined, passed down through generations of women's shared experience. Nobody frames it that way, but that is exactly what it was. Now, here is where I need to give you the part of this story that is genuinely complicated, because there is one. You might be thinking, okay, but what about menstrual huts? What about the idea that ancient cultures considered menstruating women unclean, dangerous, polluting, and literally separated them from the community? And I am not going to flatten that history, because it is real. In Levitical law, a menstruating woman was ritually impure for 7 days. In ancient India, and in the practice of chowpadi that continues in some rural areas today, menstruating women were separated from the household entirely. Across multiple ancient cultures on multiple continents, menstrual blood was treated as something with unusual, and often feared, power. The anthropologists Thomas Buckley and Alma Gottlieb spent years researching this. In their 1988 collection Blood Magic, they pushed back against the single story. In some societies, they documented menstrual seclusion was not experienced by women as exile. It was a designated space of rest, of women-only community, of knowledge transmitted between generations of women without male presence or oversight. A formal pause in the relentless demands of agricultural labor, childcare, and domestic work. In others, it was oppressive isolation dressed up in ritual language. The truth is, it was both, in different places at different times for different women. Ancient women were not a monolith. They were individuals navigating complex systems, just like today. What almost every ancient culture agreed on, across continents, across thousands of years, was that menstruation was not trivial, not biological noise to be quietly managed and forgotten. The Greek word catharsis, which we now use to mean emotional release, the feeling you get crying at a devastating film, was used by Aristotle as a medical term partly to describe menstruation. A purging, a renewal, a process with meaning woven into the language itself. Hippocrates used menstrual patterns to diagnose overall health. Soranus described cycle changes as indicators of systemic illness. Healers across multiple ancient traditions read menstrual shifts as a diagnostic window into a woman's nutritional state, stress response, and physical condition. The body was broadcasting information, and ancient women were trained to listen to it. We have built a world where that feedback loop is optional, where you can suppress, delay, or eliminate the menstrual cycle with a prescription. And by many measures, that is genuinely useful. That is freedom. But in the optimization, something was also lost. 3,000 years of women's medical knowledge treated the cycle as information-rich, as diagnostically significant, as worth paying close attention to. The Egyptian woman waking up near the Nile in 1500 BCE, the Roman woman folding soft wool at dawn, the Norse woman walking to the riverbank to collect moss before her day began. These were not primitive people waiting to be rescued by modern industry. These were intelligent people with deep observational skills, maintaining bodies of knowledge that took generations to build, navigating the same biology with a sophistication the written record consistently failed to credit them with. They just were not the ones who got to write the history books. Now you know what they would have put in them.